It's Sunday evening. Chris Ward is at home with his parents. He's watching football on the television with his father when they hear a knock at the door. He answers and a man says, "All right, Chris, I'm here to talk to you about Celtic." The man then pushed past Chris into the house. A second man then appeared, dressed in black, and a third. Chris worked at Northern Bank in Belfast, which was the largest retail bank in Northern Ireland. The men made it clear to Chris that they were here because of the bank he worked in, and if he and his family cooperated, they would be fine. If they didn't, they would be killed. But Chris and his family weren't the only hostages that night. And what transpired ended up being the largest cash robbery in British and Irish history. This is the story of the Northern Bank robbery. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast about the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. Before we get into the robbery, I think it's important to understand the political climate in Northern Ireland at this time. It's 2004, 6 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. There is peace, and the violence for the most part has indeed stopped. But when it comes to unity, there is still a lot to be done. It's messy and convoluted, but I'll try and explain it as best as I can. As a result of the Good Friday Agreement, it was decided that the largest unionist party would lead the country hand in hand with the largest nationalist party. The two dominant political parties at the time of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement were the nationalist SDLP, who were fiercely opposed to violence and paramilitary activity, and on the unionist side, the UUP, or Ulster Unionist Party, who were a slightly more moderate unionist party. They abhorred the actions of the Republican paramilitaries, but they were willing to work with them as long as it led to peace. The UUP helped get the peace agreement across the line, but at a significant cost to their party. They lost a lot of support from unionists, and many of its members defected and joined the Democratic Unionist Party, or DUP, including Arlene Foster and former politician Jeffrey Donaldson, who, as of writing, faces trials on historical sex offence charges. This caused the DUP to become the dominant unionist party in Northern Ireland in 2003, and they remain it to this day. The DUP are significantly more hardline, conservative, and completely rejected the Good Friday Agreement, backing out of the talks altogether. They simply wouldn't work with anyone who was an ex-paramilitary who had carried out attacks against unionists. Sinn Féin, who were originally the political wing of the Provisional IRA, claimed that they left violence behind and were completely devoting themselves to the political process, but the DUP simply did not trust this. And like the UUP, the SDLP also saw a decline in their popularity after the signing of the agreement. They were seen as outdated, and Sinn Féin overtook them as the dominant nationalist party in 2003. So the SDLP and UUP, who stood a chance of working together, are out, replaced by Sinn Féin and the DUP, who despise each other and now have to hold hands and lead the country together. It was never going to be an easy one. That brings us to Stormont Gate in 2002. I'll be brief, as it probably needs its own episode, but an alleged Provisional IRA spy ring and intelligence gathering operation was discovered in Stormont, the Parliament buildings of Northern Ireland. The DUP were furious when this emerged, that there was a possibility that they were being spied on by the Provisional IRA, and this may have been allowed by Sinn Féin. So power sharing collapsed and direct rule from London returned. The Provisional IRA were also dragging their heels when it came to showing proof that they had decommissioned their weapons. They also refused to support the newly formed police service, the PSNI. For power sharing to continue, the Provisional IRA would need to show unionists that they were willing to leave violence and criminality behind and move forward. But their actions continued to refute this. So in the lead up to the Northern Bank robbery, that's where Northern Ireland is politically. A tiger kidnapping is a unique term that actually originated in Ireland. Tiger kidnapping gets its name from how tigers stalk prey. Criminals observe and follow targets before striking suddenly. The tactic evolved from IRA methods used in the 1970s, where hostages were forced to plant bombs. British police then coined the term tiger kidnapping in the 1980s, and then it saw widespread use in Ireland in the 1990s. It's a particularly smart way of procuring money. Anyone in Ireland would be familiar enough with them, but the way they work is simple enough. A bank is a very secure place with lots of protections and fail-safes. But its weakest point is its staff. Why bother carrying out a risky robbery in a bank when you can just make one of the employees do it for you? So once you've targeted the employee, the next stage involves kidnapping or threatening at gunpoint a loved one close to the employee. You then instruct them to enter the bank and withdraw the money and bring it to a location. The loved one or family member is then released. It sounds very simple, but it's surprisingly effective, and there was a surge in tiger kidnappings on the island of Ireland in the early 2000s, targeting banks, cash depots and businesses. Authorities and banks tried their best to clamp down on this, taking a number of measures to make it more difficult for thieves. One was to introduce dual access to vaults, so no single employee could enter a vault. As well as that, senior bank employees had panic buttons secretly installed in their homes, usually in their bedrooms. But even with these precautions in place, authorities were not able to prevent what transpired on Sunday night on December 19th, 2004. Chris Ward worked as a bank official at the headquarters of Northern Bank on Donegal Square West in Belfast. On Sunday evening, he was sitting at home watching football on TV with his father when he heard a knock at the door. There were a good few people in the house. His father, who he was watching television with, then his mother was upstairs in bed, and his older brother Gerard was also upstairs with his girlfriend Ursula. Chris got off the couch and opened the front door and was met with a man with a black baseball cap on and a scarf pulled up high to his face. The man asked him about the football team Celtic, which wasn't unusual as Chris was the assistant treasurer of the Glasgow Celtic Supporters Club. The man pushed past Chris into his parents' home, and two others followed him in. They made their way into the kitchen and told him that they were there because of his work in Northern Bank. The men explained to Chris that they were going to take him away for 24 hours, and during that time his family would be held in the family home. As long as Chris did as they requested, his family would not be harmed. This was a Catholic home, and one of the men took a picture down off the wall, which was of a holy figure. He then asked the family members to place their hand on it and swear that they would do as the men demanded. If they did, Chris would be fine. If they caused trouble, he wouldn't. With the rules established, the men then sent Chris up to his bedroom to get his work clothes. He worked at the cash centre in the bank, in the heart of Belfast City, and his outfit consisted of dark trousers and a polo shirt. He was followed upstairs, where he packed his work clothes, some underwear, a toothbrush, into a mid-sized black Umbro bag. Meanwhile, his brother Gerard was walked around the house and directed to disconnect the phone lines and internet connections. All the family's phones were then switched off and collected. Gerard was allowed to change his voicemail to say that he was ill, so no one at his job would become suspicious. A car was parked outside of Chris's home, with the back door open and the engine running. Chris was told to get in the back of the car and lie down. The man driving then produced a gun and told Chris that he will be in the car for a while and not to move or speak. Chris was driven around with no idea where he was being brought. At one stage, the vehicles were swapped and he got into the front of a different car. He soon realised that he was being driven to Loughin Island, which is a small village around 30 minutes south of Belfast. It's also where Chris's supervisor, Kevin McMullen, lived. It was all starting to make sense to Chris now. Like I mentioned earlier, by 2004, the concept of a tiger kidnapping had been around for a while, with 7 having occurred in 2004 alone. As a result, Northern Bank had taken precautions to avoid their banks being targeted. And one such precaution was that no single employee had access to the safe in the cash centres. 2 keys were required to open the main safe in the building. One of those keys would be in the possession of the management team, of which there were 5 people, and the other key was then allocated to one of the junior staff, which Chris was one of. Whoever was in possession of the keys depended on who was rostered for the week. Chris was kidnapped on Sunday evening, and the following day his late shift was due to start, and he was rostered with the key. The other person who had the second key was Chris's assistant manager, Kevin McMullen, who lived in Loughin Island. They were paired together the following day. which would fall just after the last weekend before Christmas and the busiest shopping weekend of the whole year. The vault would be chock full of cash. Kevin McMullen had enjoyed a lazy Sunday afternoon on December 19th. He went to Mass, then watched the Arsenal match on TV. He had a roast dinner and was relaxing with his wife Karen and watching TV when he saw headlights coming down the road toward his house. Kevin assumed it was one of his family members as they lived nearby. But Karen was dubious. It was quite late to be calling. He opened the door to two men. One was in full police uniform and the other had a yellow high-vis vest on. The man asked him if he was Kevin McMullen, then told him that one of his family members had been in a serious road accident and he would need to go with them and identify a body. Kevin recoiled in shock, and Karen asked the man in the doorway if the accident occurred in Hollywood, Belfast, which was where one of Kevin's sisters lived. The man said yes, and then Karen led them into the lounge. Kevin then heard one of the men shout, "Right," and suddenly he had an arm around his throat. A gun was then produced and pressed against Kevin's head. He was forced to the ground. Someone then grabbed Karen and put a gun against her head. The two were placed face down on the floor and their hands were tied behind their back. More men came into the house, but for a moment it was quiet and it was just Kevin and Karen. He asked her if she was okay, but she was crying too much to respond. Kevin was then picked up and walked into a spare room. The men were a bit more gentle with Karen, and she was also led into the spare room. More men arrived wearing balaclavas. One brandished a large knife. The man dressed as the officer began asking Kevin questions about his work. Kevin was amazed at how much the man knew about what went on in his workplace. The man then told him of previous tiger kidnappings, and one of them said to him, they did what they were told and everybody was okay. Then, speaking of the company Northern Bank, the kidnappers said to Kevin not to feel bad as the bank was nothing but a shower of orange bastards. Calling someone or something an orange bastard essentially means that they are unionist and aligned with the Protestant faith. The kidnappers then mentioned to Kevin that in the morning he would have to ring Karen's workplace and call in sick on her behalf. Karen worked in the courthouse in the nearby town of Downpatrick. She was then stood up and told that she would be brought to a different house, where she would be under the care of a woman until the robbery was carried out. But she would need to be blindfolded before she left the home. One of the kidnappers approached her with a roll of duct tape, as he intended to tape her eyes shut. She pleaded with him not to do it, saying that she had a woolly hat in her bedroom that she could use instead. He relented and followed her up to the bedroom where she found the hat. While doing so, she realised that there was a panic button in the bedroom, which, if pressed, would alert the police service that something was wrong. She thought about reaching out and pressing it, but at that exact moment, a shout of "hurry up" came from the stairs, and the thought disappeared. She grabbed a woolly hat, and she and her captor returned downstairs. They put the hat on her and duct taped it so it was tight. She was then led out of the house and into the night. Back in the house, the kidnappers were very clear with Kevin. If he did anything which would mess this operation up, or alert the authorities, they would damage his wife beyond repair. They would put a bullet in her head. If the operation went wrong, and they were all going to go to prison for kidnapping, then they might as well go to prison for murder as well. Once Karen was gone, Kevin was brought into another room in the house, where he came face to face with fellow captive Chris Ward. Chris was in a bad state, extremely upset and stressed, telling Kevin over and over, "They've got my mum and dad." The kidnappers told Kevin to calm Chris down. Kevin told him it'll all be okay and to just do what the men said. Chris and Kevin were then offered a cup of tea or coffee. Chris saw that there was a beer in the fridge and asked for a can of Miller instead. In Glenn Patterson's book, The Northern Bank Job, which is one of the sources from this episode, it's unclear if they gave Chris the beer. What is clear is that for the rest of the night, the kidnappers drilled Chris and Kevin into what they should do the following day at work. The two were due to start the Monday late shift. They were also the number 1 and number 2 key holders with access to the cash centre's basement safe. The gang seemed to know every single detail of the bank. They were familiar with the layout of the centre, the staff rosters, and the processes surrounding when the safe was accessed. They began to explain the plan. Every evening, waste paper is collected from the cash centre. This goes out in green boxes sealed with a white plastic seal. In the cash centre, boxes of freshly delivered banknotes come in, and the boxes are the same as the waste paper ones. The only difference is the seals. The ones with the new banknotes have metal seals. Chris and Kevin were told that they would have to switch the plastic seals with the metal ones. They were then given mobile phones which only had one contact in them, under the name A. They were told to ring that number at certain times throughout the day, providing updates. One of the men wearing a balaclava was smaller than the others, and kept using different accents when talking to Chris, alternating from Indian to high-pitched, almost helium-like. In later interviews, Chris said he wondered if the man was doing this because Chris knew him. At one stage, Kevin asked the men how much money they wanted them to take out of the cash centre, and the men replied, all of it. Then at 2 a.m, the men were brought into a room in Kevin's home and told to go to sleep. Chris managed to get some sleep, but Kevin stayed awake. And for hours he heard the gang scrubbing and mopping the house, presumably to remove any forensic remnants of them being here. At around 6 a.m, Chris and Kevin were woken up and they went over the plan once again. Then the intruders left the house completely. They didn't need to hold a gun to their head anymore, when they already had Karen and Chris's family. The two guys got ready for work and then left the house at 10:15 in the morning on Monday, December 20th. The kidnappers removed any shred of evidence that they had been in the house. Only two things remained. On the counter was an open packet of crisps, and then in the driveway was the hat of one of the intruders. Both seemed odd at the time, and we'll get back to the hat later. Kevin and Chris travelled in Kevin's car. They left the house early and had time to kill, so pulled into a lay-by for a while. But as they did, a dark Citroën pulled in behind them. They had no idea who it was, if it was their kidnappers, or if police had become aware of the plot. So Kevin drove off. He dropped Chris off round the corner from the cash centre and told him to go get some food to eat. He then parked in a multi-storey car park near the bank. Again, this was just a few days before Christmas, so there would have been a bit of a busy atmosphere in the cash centre. There also would have been a lot of money there, which was due to be distributed to the 95 branches around Northern Ireland that week. The four main banks in Northern Ireland at the time were Ulster Bank, Bank of Ireland, First Trust and Northern. These were all allowed to print and issue their own branded banknotes, which were accepted universally in Northern Ireland. The currency is pound sterling, so it's the same as in England, Scotland and Wales, but though Northern Irish sterling is legal tender in Great Britain, it's often not accepted. Kevin walked in past the two security guards. They sat in front of a group of monitors, which covered every part of the bank. Kevin had worked there for 13 years. They didn't ask to see his ID, and he walked on through. The two began their shift and carried out an average day's work, waiting to see what the men would say when they called them. A delivery of cash had come in, 24 green boxes, each containing between £500,000 and £1 million sterling, in crisp new £10 and £20 Northern banknotes. These would be used to refill ATMs around the city. Kevin and Chris were instructed by their kidnappers to get into the vault and switch out the seals on the boxes, from the metal ones to the plastic ones, which denoted that the boxes were filled with waste paper and not actual money. For Chris, after a very stressful night, getting into a normal day's work relaxed him a bit, and he got into the day's routine. At lunch, he went to a jewellery shop to grab something he'd ordered the week before, and got some sandwiches and drinks for himself and Kevin. At around 1:30, Kevin and Chris began staging the heist. They let themselves into the vault and began switching out the metal seals of the boxes of cash. They switched out 24 in total, and the first part of the plan was complete. Then it was 3 p.m, the time that Kevin had been instructed to ring the kidnappers. He couldn't get a signal in the basement where he worked, so he headed outside and called them at 3:05, telling them that things had been completed and asking if Karen was okay. He was worried that they would do something to her because he was late in calling them. They said that she was okay, and because of the bad phone reception, it was decided that Chris would go outside and make the remainder of the check-in calls, as it might look a bit odd if the senior manager, Kevin, kept stepping outside. So with the seals swapped, now came the next issue. How to get the cash boxes outside of the bank without the security becoming suspicious. The original plan was for the gang to bring a van into a secure parking bay called a bullion bay, where boxes of money were dropped off. Vehicles dropping off and collecting cash would drive in through an automatic shutter into the side of the building. Kevin pushed back, saying that that bay was only used by securier vans with a specific ID. A regular van would arouse suspicion. As well as that, there was a problem with the mechanism which opened the folding door to the bay. It would need to be manually opened by the security guard each time, which would be too risky during this robbery. Their van would have to park outside on the street and be loaded up there. Okay, the next problem. The staff. There were too many people in the cash centre, so they needed to get rid of them. Kevin was told to let his staff go home early. And the staff were delighted to get off early on Christmas week. With the staff gone, Chris and Kevin were then asked to do a trial run to see if everything would work. They filled Chris's black Umbro sports bag with cash. They were careful, as the two security staff did man the cameras, so they had to do it in a way that didn't look suspicious. Kevin was aware that there was a blind spot in the cash centre, where the CCTV wouldn't capture them filling up the bag. With the black bag loaded up with crisp £100 and £50 notes, Chris then walked out the back door of the cash centre. He walked around the corner to a bus stop, where he met an individual, engaged in some small talk to not look suspicious, and then handed the bag over. Chris then returned to the bank. He was never stopped or questioned by security. The dummy run had been a success. He had just handed over around 24 kilograms of cash, which amounted to around £1.2 million. We should talk a little bit about the security at the bank. The security was managed by a company called Maybin, and in this case the two officers who were on at the night were George and Billy. A later trial would find a multitude of failings on the company's side. At 6:15, a final securier van arrived. Chris and one of the guards, George, met the van in the bay and took care of a remittance docket, and then the van left. George then finished up his shift, leaving just one security guard remaining, Billy. By now, there were only 4 other late staff left in the bank. Kevin met with them and told them that there was a problem with the count and that he and Chris will have to go and do a recount, but the rest can go home. Again, it was Christmas week, so they were happy to get off early. Now they were truly alone in the basement. Time to get to work. After another phone call occurred, Chris and Kevin were told that a white van would pull up outside the bank, and they were to load the cash boxes into the van. So how would they get these boxes of cash past security? Well, they simply told the security officer that there was a rubbish collection due, and they had to bring the rubbish out and load it into the vans. The bank had been having refurbishments over the last few months, and it wasn't unusual for vans to pull up and collect rubbish, so this wouldn't have aroused the suspicion of the guard. And remember, the labels on the boxes have been switched. Chris and Kevin loaded the boxes onto a metal cage-like trolley, and then added a broken hoover and broken chair to make it look more convincing that this was a pile of rubbish. This was then brought from the cash centre to the Bullion Bay lift, to the Bullion Bay, and here the security guard Billy had to come out and open a padlock. He didn't stick around though, as he had to return to manning the cameras. The shutter was opened to the outside street, where a white van was waiting, with 2 men wearing what appeared to be very obvious fake ginger wigs, and fleeces which had delivery services written on them. This was the name of the company who had been facilitating the refurb, so the men looked the part. They reversed the van down Wellington Street at 7:05 p.m, so it was directly outside the doors of the bay. 24 boxes of money were then loaded into the van. One of the thieves then spoke to Kevin and handed him a roll of black plastic sheeting. like what you'd see on silage bales. They were told that they had to return to the bank and fill 2 more trolleys with as much used banknotes as they could. In addition to carrying newly minted ones, used banknotes which were no longer circulated were also housed in the cash centre before they were destroyed. They had 15 minutes to do it. This was a complete shock to the two, as it wasn't in the plan. They returned to the basement and began loading up the trolleys and wrapping it in the black plastic. Kevin called up to the control room, saying that the white van would be returning and could they call him when it did. The white van drove off and returned around 45 minutes later. The security guard called down to Kevin to tell him the van had arrived. The 2 trolleys were then loaded in. The men closed up the van, took back the remaining plastic wrap and drove off. The heist was complete. It was at this moment police received a phone call saying that there was some suspicious activity at the bank. A passerby had spotted 2 men with very obviously fake wigs and alerted a traffic warden who then called the police. The PSNI arrived at the scene, but unbeknownst to them it was too late. The phone call came into them at the exact moment the van drove off from the bank. They searched the streets thinking that they were looking for pickpockets. It would be hours yet before they were alerted to the actual robbery itself. With the boxes that were first loaded into the van, £18.5 million were stolen. Then with this second load of used notes, that was an additional £9 million. The total amount stolen was £26.5 million, or, for American listeners, that's around $45.7 million. So with the heist completed, Kevin and Chris remained careful. They were told to lock up and head home and not raise the alarm. They drove to Chris's house, where he was reunited with his family. 2 of the captors were still in the house. Chris's parents told him that they had been treated well. His mother had a bath, and they spent the time sitting around watching movies. There had been a surprise earlier when one of Chris's friends knocked at the door to check in on him. His mother opened the door a creak, with the kidnappers watching her from inside the house. She told Chris's friend that he was having trouble with his phone, and she said Chris would give him a call later. His mother's main fear was that Chris would be blamed for this robbery, and he would lose his job. Little did she know it would go much further than that. The kidnappers then began cleaning and removing any trace that they had been there. There was still no sign of Karen, and Kevin was worried. The men staying with Chris's family had no idea who she was. They only knew their role in the robbery. Eventually, one of the men got a call and told Kevin that Karen is okay and she will be there when he gets home. Soon after this, the kidnappers thanked the family for their cooperation, apologised for causing them inconvenience, and left. They told Chris that he was not to phone the police until 11 p.m, and told Kevin to wait 5 minutes after they left before driving home. Kevin drove home to find his house surrounded by armed police. But there was no Karen there. She was in the hospital. And her captivity story was very different to that of Chris's family. Karen remained blindfolded for nearly the entire 24 hours that she was kidnapped. She was taken from her home and placed in the back of a car. Initially, she could follow which turns the car was taking, but then the driver began doing donuts, which caused her to lose her sense of direction, and she couldn't figure out where she was being brought. She then heard branches scraping the side of the car, so she realised she must be on a narrow country lane. The car eventually stopped and the engine turned off. She was brought into a house and guided upstairs. There were 2 other men in the house. Her kidnappers had lied to her when they said that there would be a woman in the house they were taking her to. Instead, there was the original person, she called Knife Man, who had blindfolded her in her home, and 2 other mystery men. She was brought into a room where there was a chair and a bed. She didn't want to get on the bed as she was afraid that one of the men will rape her, so she asked to sit on the chair instead and was given a blanket and a pillow. Her kidnappers then offered her tea and sandwiches. She had some tea, mainly to try and keep them content. They took turns watching her and sleeping. and when she needed to use the bathroom, Knife Man guided her to the toilet and gave her privacy. She was happy to keep the woolly hat with duct tape on. If she couldn't see her kidnappers, then she posed no threat to identifying them, and they had no reason to kill her. Eventually, Knife Man checked in on her, telling her it was 11 a.m. The night was over, but it would be hours yet before the ordeal ended. The next check-in she got was at 4 p.m, telling her that everything was going smoothly with Chris and Kevin. At the house that Karen was at, she was told to remove her shoes and then was brought into a different room. She was told to strip down to her underwear and put on a boiler suit that had been placed out for her. She heard a man close the door, giving her privacy to get undressed. She took off her clothes and put on the boiler suit and then felt around the floor for her shoes, but couldn't find them. There was then a noise and the shoes were handed to her. Someone was secretly in the room watching her the entire time. Her shoes were returned to her, cleaned. Knife Man then took her by the arm and led her outside. He was angry with her and seemed to think that she knew something about the house or saw something, which she didn't at all. He warned her, saying, quote, "Remember, we know where you live. We got you once and we can get you again. And I tell you, next time will not be so nice. Next time we'll blow your fucking head off." She got into the car and Knife Man told her to take off her blindfold. Karen was terrified, thinking that she was about to be killed. She pleaded to keep the blindfold on. He said he needed it for forensic purposes, so she had to take it off. He ripped it off in one motion and then placed a sack over her head. He then told her that he would be leaving and somebody else would be looking after her. A heavy man got into the back seat of the car and pushed her head down between her legs. Karen believed that Knife Man was handing her over to the man who would kill her. She was driven around for hours before she heard a crunch of gravel outside. She'd been brought to a forest. She was taken out of the car and guided across the rough ground. She was then told to lie face down on the ground. Karen was certain that she was about to be killed and secretly buried. She then asked the men to return her body to her family. She didn't want to become one of the disappeared. Instead, the men told her to lay there and count 10 minutes, and then she was free to leave. They then disappeared, but not before setting fire to the car that brought them there. Karen counted as much as she could, and then got up and removed the hood. She then realised it was her car which they had burned out, even though they had promised to return it to her the night before. She walked around disoriented, eventually finding a road. It was winter and she was wearing nothing but a boiler suit, freezing. She tried to flag a car down, but it kept driving. Eventually she came across a house. She knocked on the door and a man answered, and she asked to use his phone.
Hello, please, can I help you? Hello, it's George Stark here. Come on, man, somebody's fucking having to ransom. Ring back.
The police were called and an ambulance arrived and brought her to the hospital as she was starting to show signs of hypothermia. Karen's ordeal was finally over. Back at Chris's house, a call was placed to the police at 11 p.m. on Monday evening.
First emergency.
Hello, how you doing? I wonder if you could help me. My name's Chris Ward. I actually work in the Northern Bank Cash Centre. We used to be the Robbery.
Approximately how much?
30 minutes.
Oh my God.
At that moment, Kevin had also called the police and was telling them what happened. It was close to midnight before Chris eventually hung up the phone. The following morning, all was quiet at the bank as journalists descended upon the scene. This robbery was reported all over the world. It was an absolutely massive operation and one of the largest cash robberies in history. So who carried it out? There were not many gangs in Northern Ireland who could carry out something this sophisticated, with multiple teams of people and safe houses. All signs immediately pointed towards the Provisional IRA. But though everyone on the street seemed to know it was them, it would be a little bit longer before the PSNI was happy to say it publicly. I've explained the political situation before, But the government had just collapsed 2 years ago, and to many, a robbery like this just proved that Republicans had no interest in their commitment to peace. It was also around this time that Sinn Féin and the DUP were coming close to a deal. This completely jeopardised that. Police in Northern Ireland came into this investigation with virtually nothing to go on. They had no intelligence whatsoever, and the trail was cold from the very start. This robbery was a big test for the newly formed PSNI, or rather perhaps a failure for allowing such a huge operation to occur without any form of intelligence. Patterson wrote in his book that many of the old hardened RUC detectives who had been working during the Troubles retired once the PSNI was reformed, and there was sort of a gap in this newly formed PSNI, who were a third the size of their predecessor during the height of the Troubles. On Christmas Eve, 4 days after the robbery, houses around Belfast were raided by the PSNI. An absolutely massive amount of cash had been stolen. It had to be easily findable. Houses of known IRA members and sympathisers were searched. I saw one source saying that officers opened up Christmas presents that were wrapped under the family's Christmas trees, looking for the money, but none was found. Families were furious, claiming that this was political and sectarian policing. I guess because it was a bank and nobody was killed, there was some sort of support seen around Belfast for the robbery, and graffiti began to appear around Belfast cheering on the robbers, with one saying, "Carlsberg don't do robberies, but if they did." I'd imagine the money went south of the border into the Republic of Ireland, as that would be the hardest to follow, but it really isn't clear where the money actually went. Though we did get a few crumbs, which I'll get to later. On January 6th, in the new year, British Prime Minister Tony Blair issued a statement condemning all forms of criminal activity and alluded to the Provisional IRA. Then, the next day, Chief Constable of Northern Ireland, Hugh Ord, released his statement. All eyes were on him to admit who he thought was behind the attack, and he had to make sure that he was absolutely certain before he made his announcement. He knew there would be implications to what he was about to say.
The Provisional IRA were responsible for this crime, and all main lines of inquiry currently undertaken are in that direction.
Shortly after, Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern also made a statement implicating Sinn Féin. This was a big moment. Gerry Adams was the leader of Sinn Féin at the time, and he and Deputy Leader Martin McGuinness publicly rebuffed what Hugh Ord said, stating that they had spoken to the IRA leadership, who denied any involvement in the robbery. Again, you have to remember the relationship between Sinn Féin and the IRA is very significant. But the IRA have issued denials like this many times during the Troubles, and for many, they simply didn't believe it. This was an incredibly stressful period for Martin McGuinness.
The Taoiseach has made remarks which I take grave exception to. I can tell you I would be a very disillusioned Irish Republican if someone said to me they were prepared to put a process that I have put my life and soul into, risk my very life for, at risk for 10 or 20 or 30 million pounds. In my opinion, it would not be worth it.
Critics pointed out that if Sinn Féin had prior knowledge of the heist and failed to stop it, then they were unfit to govern Northern Ireland. Then, in Parliament, UUP member David Burnside used parliamentary privilege to name who he believed to be the ringleader in the theft, Bobby Storey. Bobby Storey was a beloved Republican and ex-member of the Provisional IRA. He had taken part in organising the 1983 Maze prison escape and was considered the head of intelligence in the IRA for a period from the mid-1990s and was believed to have organised a number of other heists. But despite their suspicions, he was never questioned. During research for this episode, I came across an excellent documentary presented by Dara McIntyre. In it, McIntyre was told that there was often tensions between the political leadership of the IRA and the military leadership. And though the group would have sat at the same table, they were not all privy to the same information. So the denials being issued by members from Sinn Féin could be legitimate because they may have never known that this operation was going to happen. Meanwhile, the investigation was revealing very little. There was virtually no forensic evidence that was useful at the scenes, and the robbers had been extremely thorough with their cleaning. There was the hat, which was found on the ground outside Kevin's home, and a forensic analysis of a hair found on the hat was a match for a man named Dominic McAvoy. McAvoy said that he was a roofer and works all across South Down. He also said that he often lends his hat to friends. There was no denial that that was his hat, but there was also no proof that he was at Kevin's house wearing it. He ultimately received no charges. CCTV footage revealed very little. The entire robbery was caught on camera in the vault, but this was all carried out by victims Chris and Kevin. The CCTV in the bullion bay and outside by the entrance were both not working. As a result, there was no CCTV footage of the van at the bank. The security company Maybin fired the site security manager as well as the 2 security guards who were working there on the night of the robbery. The company was then sold in 2006 and changed its name to Resource. On the bank's side, it wasn't looking likely that the money was going to be recovered. So a couple of months later in March, Northern Bank decided to do something drastic. Of the £26.5 million stolen, around £16.5 million of that haul was brand new banknotes. So what Northern Bank decided to do was withdraw all of its banknotes in circulation. This was the first time that this had been done in UK banking history. This meant that they would redesign and reprint all of the banknotes in circulation in different colours, and the older ones would become useless. You could bring them into a bank and exchange them for the newer ones though. But this was no use for the robbers, because police knew the serial numbers of the notes stolen, so they couldn't be brought into a bank to be exchanged. So in this way, around £16.5 million stolen became unusable and worthless. Hugh Ord called it the largest theft of waste paper in human history. But even with the money being completely useless, virtually none of it has ever turned up. But in the case of the other notes, which were used, they were virtually untraceable. In the wake of the robbery, Chris and Kevin took some time off before going back to work for the bank. They returned to the bank in October, but were assigned to other roles. During this time off, Chris took a holiday to the Canary Islands, where he was approached by 2 Englishmen, one called Charlie and one called Vinny. They said that they had a business opportunity for them and asked if they'd come into any money recently. With this extremely poor attempt at entrapment, it would appear that the security services had their suspicions that Chris was somehow involved in the robbery. Kevin McMullen had been quickly written off as a suspect. His wife had been through a horrible ordeal, but Chris's family were treated quite gently by comparison. No gun was produced for them in the same way it was for Karen. Chris was also from a Republican part of Belfast, and crucially had prepared the staff rota for the week, so he had the capacity to prepare the rota with the heist in mind. So in a bizarre twist of events, 11 months after the robbery at Northern Bank, Chris was arrested. He was charged with the false imprisonment of his own family, the false imprisonment of Kevin and Karen, and also the armed robbery of £26.5 million. This went to trial in 2008 and was a bit of a shambles. In reality, there was little to no evidence linking Chris to the crime. Most of the case was entirely circumstantial. It also turned out that the original rota that Chris had prepared did not have Kevin or Chris scheduled on the night of the robbery. It had been changed by a senior manager and not by him. Chris was acquitted and the case was dismissed, but his mother's fears were realised. During this process, he was dismissed from his job at the bank as a result of talking to the press. This episode is being written in 2026, so 22 years after the robbery occurred. And what developments have happened in that time? Very little, but Gardaí in the Republic of Ireland definitely had more luck in finding some of the money. In the months following the Northern Bank robbery, many believed that the money was flowing south. Irish Gardaí, who had been monitoring money laundering in the Republic, suddenly saw an influx of Northern Irish sterling and believed that some of this money was from the Northern Bank robbery. In February 2005, Irish Gardaí found over £60,000 during raids in Dublin and Cork. This money was traced back to Northern Bank. One instance saw the money hidden in a box of laundry detergent, literal laundering. That same day, 2 men, both members of Sinn Féin, were arrested in Cork. Another man, Don Blaney, was arrested after his neighbours reported him trying to burn cash in his home. Charred banknotes were floating up the chimney and into the air. Some bullets were also found at his property. One of the stranger cases saw around £50,000 of the newly minted useless cash found in the PSNI's Sports and Social Club in Belfast. Initially, this was seen as being planted there to distract the authorities, but others saw this as a deliberate taunt. You can't find the money, so we'll leave it in your back garden. The most significant result in the quest to find the money was an investigation into Ted Cunningham, who owned a Cork-based finance company called Chesterton Finance. His house was raided, which led to the discovery of £2.4 million of the Northern Bank linked cash. In Dublin, the chairman of the Bank of Scotland in Ireland, Phil Flynn, resigned from his post as he was in business with Ted Cunningham. Phil Flynn was a former vice president of Sinn Féin and had been an advisor to Irish Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. Investigations led overseas, and it was believed that intermediaries within the IRA were in Bulgaria, trying to buy an apartment block, hotel, bank and shopping mall for around £15 million. Both Ted Cunningham and Phil Flynn were found to have travelled to Bulgaria. Phil Flynn denies any involvement in the Northern Bank robbery and was never prosecuted. But in 2008, Ted Cunningham went to court, facing 10 charges of money laundering. He denied the charges, but admitted that he knew that the money found in his home came from the Northern Bank robbery. Cunningham would spend around a decade facing and bringing various court cases to the Irish government, but perhaps the most significant one saw him charged with 10 counts of money laundering. Ted and his son Timothy were convicted in 2009, and Ted was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Timothy was given a suspended sentence of 3 years. Ted was released after 3 years after he successfully appealed his conviction. While in prison, he had been taken to hospital around 16 separate occasions, as he suffered from a hereditary condition which led to frequent nosebleeds and made his time in prison very difficult. Ted Cunningham ended up suing the prison authorities for negligence of duties and inhumane conditions, and in January 2026, he received a significant 5-figure sum. As of writing, Ted Cunningham still maintains that the money found in his home came from a Bulgarian businessman hoping to invest in Ireland. Here's Ted speaking to Dara McIntyre on a recent documentary.
You're still fighting, aren't you, after all these years?
I will fight until the day I die. I know who I got the money from. And it was not from the Northern Bank. Not one note was proved to have been in the Northern Bank on the day. You can go through the transcripts of the trial. The forensic Garda stated that all her investigations were negative and inconclusive.
Where did that money come from?
It came from business associates that I was dealing with in Bulgaria.
You admitted in the second trial to 2 counts. Why ultimately did you admit to those?
Because I feared for my life with what I had experienced when I was in Cork prison.
You regret agreeing to that, don't you?
100%. If I had my way back again, I'd have gone to jail.
But you know, now looking from the outside, a cynic would say, look, here's all this money in this man's house.
Yes.
He's been to Bulgaria recently. Yes, he's convicted. He gets off. Fair enough. But then he actually admits guilt later on for 2 minor charges. But looks like a duck and walks like a duck. It's a duck.
Well, you can look at it this way. What other people think at this stage doesn't matter to me. As far as I'm concerned, the state, they needed a fall guy.
You believe they needed a fall guy and you were that fall guy?
Yes. I'm the victim. I can't say any more, but this is not the end of the story.
Ed Maloney wrote, in the book The Secret History of the IRA, that this robbery gave us a glimpse into the IRA's burgeoning financial empire. which was estimated to be around £200 million worth of hotels, discos, bars, and apartments in the Caribbean, Portugal, Turkey, and parts of Ireland. The Northern Bank robbery was a bit of a watershed moment for the IRA. I've read that if something to the tune of £2 million was stolen, this could have been condemned and eventually overlooked. £26.5 million was simply too much. In the Republic of Ireland, a very firm stance was taken, and, quote, the days of indulging the provisional leadership had come to an end. Facing mounting pressure, Sinn Féin also began to change their wording. Instead of denying the provisionals had any involvement, McGuinness said, quote, whoever carried out the robbery are also hostile to the Sinn Féin agenda and the peace process, and under no circumstances should any of these people get their way in the ongoing discussions, which will have to take place if we are to resolve our political difficulties. This robbery severely damaged Sinn Féin's credibility on the global stage. And then just 1 month later, something else would happen that would have a huge impact on the provisional IRA and Sinn Féin's credibility. Catholic man Robert McCartney was having drinks with a friend in a bar when he ended up in an altercation with members of the provisional IRA. A brawl ensued, and McCartney and his friend were attacked with broken bottles before being dragged out into the street and beaten with metal bars. Both men then had their throats slit before being stabbed. McCartney died of his injuries. In the immediate aftermath of the killing, the doors to the bar were locked and the place was wiped down and cleaned thoroughly. Names and addresses were taken of anyone not local, and they were all told to say nothing to the police. As a result, when the police began interviewing for witnesses, all 71 people in the bar claimed that they were in the bathroom when the attack occurred. Again, this was 2005. Attacks like this were meant to be a thing of the past. And then there was the cover-up, and then there was the wall of silence. Between the robbery and this killing, the Provisional IRA were showing to the world that they had no interest in returning to peace. So in the wake of this killing, things got significantly worse for Sinn Féin. Robert's sisters had a meeting with the IRA, who said that they knew who the killers were and would shoot them if that's what the sisters wished. This never transpired, but it meant that the IRA was hiding the truth and trying to deal out their own justice instead of trusting the legal system. The sisters were then invited over to the White House to meet with President George Bush on St. Patrick's Day. That year, no Northern Irish politicians would be invited to the White House, something which was perceived as a deliberate snub towards Sinn Féin. And in the wake of this killing, the US was very critical of Sinn Féin, and the sentiment toward them was turning. Gerry Adams often travelled over to the US for St. Patrick's Day, and in many cases used the trip to raise funds for Sinn Féin. But he was told very sternly that there would be no fundraising on this trip. As well as that, many of Adams's political allies in the US snubbed him, either by cancelling meetings with him or by publicly renouncing the actions of the IRA. Irish America was saying enough. The offer to shoot the killers was insulting. The time to put the guns down was now. Sinn Féin needed to do something drastic to show that they were committed to peace. So on July 28, 2005, the Provisional IRA announced an end to its campaign of armed struggle, ordering its volunteers to dump arms and to pursue Republican goals by only peaceful means. By September, international weapons inspectors issued a statement confirming the full decommissioning of the IRA's weaponry, and this paved the path to allow for power sharing to resume in 2007. This more or less brings us to the end of the story of the Northern Bank robbery. In total, like I've said, around £26.5 million was stolen. 16.5 of that became completely useless after the bank's redesign of the notes, which left around £10 million of the used bills, which was more or less untraceable. So what happened to the money? And more importantly, why was it stolen? Most sources that I've studied for this episode say that this was the price of peace. And the main theory is that this theft secured the IRA's pension fund. In order to guarantee that these ex-paramilitaries could retire and leave violence behind, there needed to be a pension fund for them, for the time that they spent as paramilitaries. In theory, this would be easy to prove. if a bunch of ex-paramilitaries suddenly started buying cars and building extensions onto their home, which did not transpire. Maybe this was a payoff to stop them returning to violence. Maybe the British government was aware of this and believed that this was a price that had to be paid to put an end to the provisional IRA. We will probably never really know. A WikiLeaks cable was released in 2010 which reported that senior Irish government officials believed that Sinn Féin's leaders were aware of the Northern Bank heist plan. There were also concerns that money from the robbery and other illegal IRA operations was seeping into the political party Sinn Féin. Again, that's impossible to prove. Then in late 2025, state papers were released, which revealed that the UK government officials told their Irish counterparts in January 2005 that they were given to believe IRA figure Bobby Storey was responsible for the robbery, but again, he was never charged. It really was a perfectly executed robbery. Speaking at Chris's trial, when asked about the effect of the kidnapping on him and his wife, Kevin said, "I would say it certainly has had a devastating effect on our lives." Though many arrests were made, as of writing, the only person ever convicted in relation to the robbery was Ted Cunningham, and it's unlikely that there will be any more convictions. There's no doubt that plenty of this money was successfully laundered. It's just not clear exactly where it ended up. With regard to the useless, newly minted bills, we'll probably never know. My guess is that there are plenty of holes in the ground around Ireland where hundreds of thousands of completely useless banknotes lay buried. I think we'll leave it there for now. Thanks, and see you next time.